All right, so the recording started. So we're here today to look at, let's see if we can get this to cooperate. We're looking at this chapter 2. Did anybody get a chance to go through some of this stuff on the classroom? It's pretty long, but I mean, there's I take it that very few people had an opportunity. All right, no problem. Okay, so
It was
yes, go ahead, Akim.
no, I was gonna say it was uploaded today. It was opened up today because I kept checking whole weekend and yesterday I didn't see this week opened up.
No, the whole class is open up.
Oh, you
It's,
mean in terms of like going through the book and stuff like that? Sorry,
well, I
I
did
must
the
have been.
presentations
Yeah.
here, so these are all.
Oh, I understand now. I understand. Apology. I'm thinking I'm mixing up classes because it's just back one after the other.
All right, I
Okay,
hear you.
sorry
Okay,
about that.
that's a possibility that can happen. All right, so in terms of the chapter 2, what we're really going to be looking at here is we're really going to be looking at the development of leadership studies throughout the history of its development to date, or at least coming up to the model that we're looking at. And one of the first things that we want to start by looking at is people's perception of leadership and what is often seen as. And the text starts off by looking at, oftentimes people look at leadership as if it's some kind of prize to get. So we think about it when, when you speak to people and they say, "Oh, I'm the CEO of this company," or "I'm the leader of this organization," and stuff like that. It feels like it's kind of like a boost. They can use it as some sort of status symbol in society. Now, if you're the boss of an organization or the leader of an organization, the people around you may view you differently than some people might like you as you're a good boss, that kind of stuff, and others would say, this is the worst boss you ever had in your life, that kind of stuff. So it depends upon where you are and how you feel about it, and that's the nature of leadership. But a lot of people still view leadership as one of those things that we have to have in order to become successful. All right. And I like this quotation here from James McGregor. And he says leadership is one of the most observed and least understood phenomenons on earth. And they're quite right, because again, the problem with leadership is that everybody looks at leadership differently. And that creates a bit of a problem. Now, there are lots of people who have studied leadership throughout time frames, and in fact, you can look at all of these different textbooks here that I found online, and these are just a few of the hundreds that I saw that were available. And we are going to actually be using this textbook here, the Leadership Experience. I have actually taken part in this one in previous studies with the college. And I've also done another one called the Leadership Challenge, um, which is a different study from a different author, from different people. Tim Robbins or Tony Robbins might be somebody that you might be familiar with in other studies. Drucker is another individual that's involved with a lot of studies with leadership. How many of you all have ever seen any of these, or at least are knowledgeable about these different programs that exist all over the place? Have you ever seen leadership courses being offered from various institutions?
Yeah, I think like SPCS and CTS as well.
Yep, they have, and they would offer different programs from different authors, positions, and that type of stuff. Yes. Okay. I'm not talking about degree programs. I'm just talking about leadership programs. Okay.
Also,
Yes.
a lot of these, well, I want to call them gurus. We call them gurus. A lot of them, they have their seminars and they offer programs online.
Yes.
over the course of whatever time frame. And
Yes.
it's like a subscription based thing where
That's
they
correct.
basically carry you through step by step how to achieve, this leadership style and implement it in your life and whatnot.
That's correct. Yeah. So it's motivational type programs that you're looking at. How to become a natural born leader, that kind of stuff. So the different terms that they utilize with. All right. So this one here, the leader in me, greatness happens or great happens here. That type of thing. Those are the kind of headlines they're going to use. Tony Robbins is one of those guys. He does a lot of online programs. Stephen Covey, when he was alive, he actually they used to do a lot of online training as well. But since his death, things have kind of reverted a little bit. The last text that he had put out from his program was something called The Eighth Habit. Anybody ever saw that textbook, The Eighth Habit? I think I purchased it at some point in time, somewhere around from it. All right, so we're familiar or understand that leadership has a lot of activity taking place, but does it mean that it's actually productive? Well, it depends, on what you get out of it. Now, the problem of leadership is that the way it's made up makes it difficult for us to arrive at a definition, because most times the different contexts that we find ourselves living in would create differences in how leadership is positioned in our in our perception, and how we look at it is going to be affected by a lot of the other things taking place in our lives. So the vast majority of leadership programs that we see, like these here, they have a tendency to be very US based or Western based. And when you move away from Western societies into Eastern and Southern societies, what you're going to find is that the view of leadership is going to change. Eastern culture in particular has a different vision of what leadership is going to be about. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, we tend to be inundated with leadership programs that come out of the Western cultures. Are those the best systems that we should be looking at? I mean, the one we're looking at is actually North American in its construct. So we have to assess now what is going to be best for us. Now, whenever we think of leaders, we are always looking towards our leadership to create to create solutions for problems that we have. Now, some of the solutions or the problems that I've identified here are very broad-based: climate change, globalization, poverty, healthcare, education, public services. What would be your biggest concern? What would you like our leaders to look at in this country that are of critical issues for us here in Trinidad and Tobago, and Grenada as well, because we have somebody from Grenada in class as well. What suggestions would you make as opposed to those that we have here? Anybody? Just asking for suggestions.
Well, crime
Right.
is
Okay. Crime is one as of concern. What else?
gas prices.
All right.
So honestly, I feel like when I walk to work these days, it's horrible. It's very horrible. Just putting that out there.
Yeah, no, you can put it out. And that has to do with resource access, right? Because how do we access the resources we need when we're dealing in a situation where there's a increasing cost, or what we call inflationary pressure in our society? And the question, how many of you all looked at the budget, by the way, just as point of interest, and have similar concerns like what Megan just referred to? I'm telling you, you can vent here, okay?
So when I watch it, I literally, sorry to say, but I get a headache because the things that they want to raise just not making sense. Like for instance, they want to raise cereal and I think it's what the canned goods and whatnot. the majority of people in this country cannot survive on the salaries that they have, and worse are the ones that getting grants. How you expect people to survive on that?
Right. How did you get to the point where they're talking about raising prices of cereals?
There was a breakdown. I could actually I don't know if it was sent in the chat or actually didn't check the chat though. There was a breakdown I was watching. I could send it to you just to show you as to what it is that they plan to increase.
When you say they plan to increase, what do you mean by that?
The government. The government. The government.
Can the government increase specific things outside of its realm of control?
I believe so. They was doing it under our noses the majority of the time. That's just my
Have you ever done a course in economics, Megan?
No, I have not.
Okay, so you're making a misnomer there, okay? It is not that the government, unless the government has strict price controls on products in the market, what causes prices to rise or fall depends upon conditions that affect demand and supply. So, for example, the one that government has made distinctively their own has been the level of subsidies for gasoline and fuel. All right, for fuels in Trinidad and Tobago, because we know those are going to go up because the government has reduced the amount of subsidies that it's paying, and is therefore saying to us that we need to pay more for a product and they will pay less because technically we're paying twice. We're paying once to buy it, and the second time we're paying indirectly by supporting the subsidy on the product. All right. Now, so that's one good. But the other goods is very unlikely that the government can directly impact upon it unless, of course, they're putting subsidies on it or they're removing subsidies from it or they're adding taxes to it.
I'll double check and I'll send it because I really need to find it back.
All right. I saw Sean had his hand up earlier. Did you want to make a contribution, Sean?
Say Benjamin.
Yes, Sean. I saw your hand up before, so I was wondering if there was something else you wanted to bring up.
Oh, I was looking at the budget to see what I mentioned about the ammonia produced and the revenue.
Uh-huh.
But I don't think I see anything mentioned about it.
Okay. Yeah, because again, the government for a long time. Go ahead.
Due to the increased price, because it jumped from like 100 a metric ton to like about nearly $1,300 a metric ton, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And
But what's causing that?
That's supposed to give you close to about 5 or 6 billion US dollars in revenue.
Yeah,
but I didn't see that.
But that's not, the company doesn't belong to Trinidad. You know? All we're going to earn from that is taxes.
Yeah, to get some kind of revenue out of it.
Well, they should get revenue in the form of taxation because they're going to tax corporate tax on companies, would have to pay those taxes to the government as part of their requirements. Yeah, right? But in terms of government ownership, remember the government has been selling off ownership of a lot of the industries in the Southern Corridor. It's been privatizing a lot of its activities. And the last one major one that it did was getting rid of Petrotrin. That is what remember the government is not supposed to be involved with production. And that's the technique that they've dealt with or they've gone through by divesting themselves. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know that they mentioned also that the government literally had to put oil in reserves because they was waiting for the price to actually to go up. Because
but it can't be the government decided to do that because the government doesn't control the market for oil. And where were we going to store reserves?
I think it was Shell was actually reserving it
Right. So
until the
private companies were stockpiling. All right.
yeah,
So and they were stockpiling because they were aware what was going on or what was happening in the Ukraine. And now is the time that they can sell those reserves that they've had and try to maximize on the profits. Because remember, they did go through a period when prices of oil was negative. During the pandemic, remember the oil prices fell to -15 and all kind of nonsense. You all remember that?
yeah. That when
Right.
we had to store it because
Yeah.
Shell would have looked.
Yes, and it was actually costing money to store it. So that's why prices end up being negative. That makes sense now. Yeah. All right, but I know people are frustrated about certain things in relation to the to oil and gas and the budget in general. And feel free to talk about it. You could vent about it if you want. That's what I'm trying to say. But that is always going to be something that we will look towards our leadership to address. What we're looking here is them addressing the issues of poverty, rising food prices, or inflationary pressure. Those are some of the concerns we have. So Megan brought up the whole issue about prices going up. We refer to that in economics as inflation. So for those of you who don't know, I'm also an econ lecturer. So what we need to do is to understand better what's going on before we start ascribing blame to people for certain things. So there's some things that the government can impact upon, but our leaders don't necessarily have all of the tools necessary to correct all of the issues that we're looking at. Because technically speaking, we can't do anything about the war in Ukraine, can we? And obviously with the war in Ukraine, there was also some damage to some oil lines. You all saw that? Some oil and gas lines.
I
And then
think that was an excuse.
in the Baltic Sea, yes. That's going to affect our oil and gas prices here as well. All right, so this is almost like a world away from us. Activities taking place there is impacting upon us directly. Now, technically, what should be happening is that the companies drilling oil and gas here in the Caribbean should be benefiting in the sense that oil prices are rising. But the problem that comes with that is that those companies will earn increased revenue. But it means that everything else that is produced using oil and natural gas as the sources of energy will have increasing prices brought on by the increasing cost of the raw materials required to produce it, which also includes things like food, and which is why prices of food will go up, not only from the changes in the fuel cost itself, and that's why the fuel cost is going up, is part of a problem. Um, Here, what we would need to do is to see oil prices kind of go back down and stabilize a little bit, because that would mean that we would have to pay as high a price for fuel prices. So in freeing up oil prices or fuel prices, there's a great tendency that when oil prices fall and fuel prices fall, we'll eventually pay less for fuel if that were to happen. But I haven't seen that happen in a little while. And it has happened in the States and Canada and other places that sell fuel at market prices. But that's something that we have not been accustomed to in our country, where we've been facing market prices. And we have to start thinking about what that from that perspective. But the whole idea is that once we give these responsibilities over to our leaders to deal with, when they can't find solutions, we oftentimes blame them for it. We blame them and sort of like what Megan said, they're raising prices on this and they doing this and they want to do that and they want to do, and we start to ascribe to our leaders things that um, they simply can't work on or they can't impact upon. but we give them the responsibility for what is going wrong. And that leads us to this section here, where oftentimes when leadership disappoints us, we start to distrust them. We don't trust them anymore. They don't care about us. They're only looking after themselves. That's the kind of attitude we start to get. And that negative attitude helps to develop what is referred to as the anti-leadership virus or vaccine. I would actually call it a virus more than a vaccine. Because what ends up happening is that it starts to make leadership look like something that's less desirable to get involved with. And therefore, people would be less willing to take on leadership positions because of the level of distrust that we show to them. And as a result of that, what happens is that the people who end up in leadership positions are not necessarily those who are best suited for the position. So we end up with a mismatch of individuals going into leadership positions that are not necessarily going to be the very best. So we have that type of what we call square pegs and round holes. So the people who should be there are not there because they don't want to take the risk of having to expose themselves to this level of ridicule and distrust that they're going to get. And even some leaders are attacked by societies as a result of those types of things. So that one of these situations that tends to come up when we start to look at leadership is that it starts to create this whole myth concept about leadership. So these are some of the myths that we want to be paying attention to here. Right, somebody is coming in again. Mr. Mohammed. Welcome back, Mr. Mohammed. All right. So
thank you.
okay. So myths about leadership. Leaders are born, not made. That's one that we have to treat with on a regular basis, actually. Leadership is hierarchical, and you need, therefore, to be holding formal positions of authority and have status and power to be considered a leader. That's something that a lot of us still hold as being true. You have to have charisma to be an effective leader. We're going to be looking at that. There is one way to lead, and that's the right way. Every other thing is wrong. And it's impossible to be a manager and a leader at the same time. So you can't manage a company and be a leader simultaneously. That's another myth. You only need to have common sense to be an effective leader. That's also a myth as well. And let's start to look at the truths. Leaders are made, not born. So even if you think you're born with leadership material, or you come from a family where your father, your mother, and so on were leaders in some sort of organizational structure, it does not automatically qualify you to become a leader. And that qualifier situation means that you have to realize that leadership is skills that have to be developed. So therefore, what's the purpose of this course? This course is actually designed for you to be able to create the skills or develop the skills and hone your skills in leadership potential and leadership in various environments, because not all of you all are doing business. Some of you all are in graphics, some of you all in communications and different areas of programs. And that it's important that you understand that leadership is a skill that you can hone and learn about, and that's important. And that's one of the reasons why this course exists. Leadership doesn't occur only at remember the myth. Yes, question. Denise, what's up?
I'm sorry, sir.
Okay. All right. So remember we talked about leadership is hierarchical. You need to hold formal positions. So that this part here, leadership occurs at all levels of organizations. So it is not only taking place from the manager or the executive of the organization. Leadership occurs at all levels throughout organizations, especially in modern organizations where you have more of a flattened organizational structure. When the group looks at complex organizations, they will start to look at this in more detail. It means that leadership can exist in different levels of an organizations and in various types of organizations. Leadership actually exists within the classroom space itself. All right, so most of you might look towards me as being a leader, and I will look towards various individuals in the class as being leadership, having leadership material and taking responsibility for certain things. And as we progress through this course, you'd realize each group is going to develop its own little leadership queries and quarrels and deal with issues coming out of that. All right, now, charisma is not a prerequisite for leadership. That's the truth. You don't have to be, it's not that charismatic people can't be good leaders, but charisma is not a prerequisite for good leadership. You don't have to be charismatic to be a leader. And one of the problems with charisma is that charisma has a very strange impact upon people. Charisma has a very emotional and emotive response, or brings up that type of stuff, and it can lead to problems, especially if charismatic people are left unchecked. So much so that Drucker says that the three most charismatic people in the last century caused the most amount of suffering in the world was Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. Now, we met Hitler in the first unit and the second unit. You all remember about him, right? One of the reasons why he rose to power, both him and Stalin, was their charismatic way of speaking to audiences and getting people to follow and support their ideas. Everybody is familiar with Stalin and Hitler. And what about Mao? When we say Mao, who's he referring to? Anybody? All right, for those of you who don't know, he's referring to Chairman Mao, who led China in what was called the Great Leap Forward. And during that time frame, millions of Chinese people suffered and died because of the problems that came with that movement in the Great Leap that we talked about. Do some research on these things, guys, so you can start to understand what we're talking about. These are a couple of people who were charismatic and had different types of impacts in society. And it's interesting. So I have these two guys here. This is Hitler. This is Mahatma Gandhi, and this is Martin Luther King. As interesting that as charismatic leaders who were trying to lead very significant, important and significant change in lives, they were both assassinated for their beliefs. And then anybody knows this gentleman here? The guy with the shades?
Kool-Aid man.
The Kool-Aid man. What's his name though? Who's the Kool-Aid man? Who said that? It's interesting.
Jim Jones.
The Reverend Dr. Jim Jones, okay?
Oh, sorry.
No.
Oh, geez.
That was his actual
Protocol's not
title.
unsafe.
Yeah. Remember, and he was a stickler for that, trust me. So anybody familiar with that, with Jim Jones and the Jonestown in Guyana and the mass suicides that took place there? You all vaguely remember that? Some of you?
Yes, sir.
Well, one person. All right, cool. All right. Again, one of the reasons why they were able to convince so many people to do things that was beyond what we would look at as being normal was because they were deemed to be charismatic individuals. Now it's very difficult for us to look back at old footage of Hitler and these in particular, and maybe even Mahatma Gandhi, because they were speaking to their audiences in languages we may not necessarily understand. But if we look back at JFK is another one that we can look at, but Martin Luther King and Jim Jones, for what exists, you'd start to recognize the sort of charismatic evangelical type of approach that they were looking at. Because I mean, the I have a dream speech is still portrayed as one of the greatest charismatic speeches that was utilized throughout history, if you understand what I mean. But we feel good about that "I Have a Dream" speech because he was speaking to something that we could all agree was better for humanity. But when we look back at the speeches that were given by the Reverend this gentleman here, good, well, I can't remember his name all of a sudden, Jones, is because of the negativity that came up as a result of what took place. So it's very difficult for us to look at that. So therefore, what we need to understand here is that you don't need to be charismatic to be a good leader. What you need to do is be paying attention to, as Drucker says here, you need to be paying attention to what is the vision and mission of the leader, not their charismatic or the degree of charisma. Although charisma does help. Dana, want to ask a question?
I was going to ask if you would say then that a charismatic leader plays on people's emotions.
If
Do you if they play on person's emotions? Because in order to
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say in order to influence people to do things that
They wouldn't normally do.
they wouldn't normally do, you would have to be really good to influence somebody to do something that's, as you said, they wouldn't normally do. Do you think, would you say then that they play a lot on people's emotions? They may, like, for instance, Jim Jones
Definitely.
and
And
Hitler, yeah.
They did.
I
They
want to
did.
give a response.
Yes, okay. You go ahead. Respond.
I was gonna say to her, it's actually not as difficult as you might think to get or evoke an emotional response from somebody. For example, you know, political leaders do it all the time. They just need to know what to say, and it automatically evokes an emotional response. I mean, in the States, Martin Luther King spoke about, I mean, he had ideas, he had different things he spoke about. But if you go to the States and you're bold enough to speak strongly on race, you're going to get an emotional response. Or, for example, if you speak about religion, there are certain things that when you speak about it, it just evokes, emotional responses. I don't know if that means that you're charismatic, but you're narcissists, for example, they can evoke emotions by the way how they operate and the way how they react. So,
Well,
I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
what charismatic people have a tendency to be able to do is they're able to use your emotions and say what they can to be able to stimulate your emotive response to certain things, which is one of the reasons why there's a lot of danger with charismatic people, because they can, in fact, through the use of that charismatic feeling or skill, they can cause people to do things that they wouldn't necessarily want to do to begin with. And they are not, the person is no longer using their rational thought, they're utilizing subjective emotional feelings to respond to something. And that's the danger that exists there. Because in most of the cases that we've come across with people who are responding to charismatic leaders, or anybody with charisma for that matter, you find yourself doing things that you wouldn't have done. And a lot of you may have experienced charismatic people in your lives in a very personal way. Individuals in your household, people that you've met at work, they're varying levels of charisma. And charisma is a very personal thing. Not everybody's charismatic systems or the way they are appeals to everybody. It's sort of like for some people, they really like this person. In Trinidad, we have this thing we talk about. My blood take this person. You ever
Yeah, sorry.
All right. You ever have that statement that people make? I'm a blood take somebody. That
All the time.
right. And that statement actually has to speak to levels of charisma. In fact, I'm pretty certain that some of you all have had charismatic teachers in your life. And those people were able to connect with you at one particular level or another. But it may not necessarily be on good things. All right. Fortunately for you, hopefully, you've only met people who have utilized their charismatic appeal to you in a positive manner, but it doesn't mean that that's going to happen all the time. That's a dangerous thing. Huh? All right. So let's move along from charisma. As with anything in life, there's no one right way to do anything. And in fact, in the model that we're going to be looking at in the next chapter, we're going to be saying that there are different ways in which to approach leadership, and there are different techniques to utilize, and we need to learn all. And the various types of leadership that you want to use or you might use is influenced by your gender, your cultural identity, and your personal value system. So that, and your own life experiences. Those are the things that will impact upon the type of leadership techniques that you're going to utilize, the style, the approach, even the charismatic approach you think you might want to be utilizing as well. What do you appeal to, logic or emotion? Those are the things that you're going to develop, or you're going to be able to appeal to both. Those are the kind of things you want to look at as well. All right. So they did say the myth is about you can't be a manager and a leader at the same time. And the fact of the matter is that what we need to understand is that management and leadership are two distinctly different activities. Managers are people who are trying to ensure that the goals of an organization are met. And they have to work with the resources and the people with whom they're given charge over to be able to manage them in such a way to get the largest output from these resources um, in the most efficient manner. That's what management is. But inside of that is the relationship and the nature of how a manager treats with those people who are subordinate to him. That is a leadership activity, because you can have management type activities and then leadership activities. So once we understand that there are two distinctly different activities, what you find is that both of them tend to work alongside each other. But what you start to recognize is that you're always going to be focused on what the outcome is and what the outcomes are, because that's what your focus is from a management point of view. Your leadership point of view, and I like the distinction that's made by Zelensky or Zelenix here, that leaders are focused on making sure we do it not the right way, but we're doing the right thing. So whereas the manager is looking at making sure they meet the objectives of the organization, leadership looks at if we are doing if we're achieving these goals in an ethical, meaningful manner. Does this add value to life beyond the organization? Whereas managers have to think about what they're doing only in the context of the organization. Leaders look at the context of things taking place in the context of wider life. So that's a nice distinction that we look at too. But there's a huge overlap between one and the other that we have to recognize, that managers and leadership both have an over, which is one of the reasons why a lot of the programs that you're looking at that exist for leadership and so on actually are related to management. In fact, a lot of leadership comes from the business management elements that we see outside there. All right. So they started talking about this whole overlap management. So we could skip off that rest of that element. Leadership is teachable. We wouldn't have this course if we didn't think that leadership was a teachable and learnable process and learnable skill. So the approach that we're going to look at is by this latter part here. Learning about leadership and developing as a leader is a lifelong process involving preparation, experience, trial and error, self-examination, and a willingness to learn from mistakes and successes. So one of the things we tend to do is we tend to focus only when things go wrong and reflecting on it. But we should also reflect on when things go right. Well, what happened there? What did we get right? What we didn't get right? That kind of stuff. Those are all the things. But leadership is therefore looked upon as being a learnable skill, teachable skill. All right. In terms of defining leadership, the first time the word leader was utilized, at least in the English language, was about in the 1300s. And the word leadership emerged in the 1800s. So the noun and the verb kind of developed, took a couple hundred, around 500 years to kind of get developed, and was using and primarily it was only utilized in political context. And that's important because, again, the reason for that had to do with the fact that people were looking towards people for inspiration, and their leadership potential was not something that was trying to define and studied until this time frame. Formal definitions started to come about in the 1900s to about 1929. So that's when we really started to look at that. In the 80s, we had about 110 definitions. There were definitions coming up later on. Primarily, however, most of the definitions would come up from academic standpoints. All right, and we start from the 80s to 200, and then 366, and it keeps on growing from there. And of course, most of this is always going to be coming from academia. So it's going to be from a scholarly point of view. An early definition by Mumford defined leadership. Mumford here is one of the early people who started working. And look at this definition: the preeminence of one or a few individuals in a group in the process of control of societal phenomena. Now, when I think of, or when I read that, what I think about is a master of puppets. And in fact, I always think about master puppets from Metallica as a result of that. So one person controlling others, and most times unknowingly so. So that kind of manipulation aspect is something that comes from that definition there. And it'll be interesting to know that a lot of people actually believe this particular or look upon leadership from that perspective. That it means that we are, if we want to be a leader, it means we have to learn how to control things, control people, control what's happening here and there. We're manipulating people with or without them knowing. How many of you all have ever come across Machiavellian views of the, have you ever heard of Machiavelli, Prince Machiavelli? No?
I heard of it soon, but I really can't remember exactly what it is.
All right, well, Machiavellian is a description of a methodology that is utilized for kingship and for leadership. And it actually is something that was looked at even in more detail when we started to look at politics. There's a tendency to look at it from a Machiavellian point of view. The verb that I'm using there, Machiavellian, to describe, was more an adjective, to describe a type of leadership that took place in politics. You should look it up because it's one of the techniques of leadership that was espoused quite early, I think in the 1600s, by Prince Machiavelli when he was writing to the prince. Okay, all right. So we understand this whole, it's starting off with these simple definitions of one person controlling everybody else, the kind of master of puppets. The contemporary or the newer definitions really now speak to a relational process based upon mutual goals and us working together as a set of people. So to go from that master puppets to where we are now, what we have to look at is how did things change over time? What was changing, or what changed for us from the beginning of the process to now? So the rest of this course here, or this chapter, is going to be looking at how the the how leadership frameworks move through the time frames from back then to now. And we're going to focus our attention on looking at the influences of anthropology, psychology, sociology, history, arts, everything that works in the system. And I think we talked about this in the chapter 1, where we talked about the different frameworks in which we look at leadership. We're going to be looking at it again next time around. So today we know that there is no one right definition of leadership. That's our modern view. And this is why we're always going to be asking, what is the purpose of leadership? And deciding the definition that fits that is to look at in what context are we talking about leadership. So if we talk about leadership in a classroom, we are looking at that situation, and therefore that determines what kind of leadership is there. But if we're looking in a social environment, let's say we're looking at a religious group, for example, what kind of leadership would work there? What's the definition of leadership there? What would be the level or the definition of leadership in an organization that is profit maximizing, that affirm that? So those are the kind of things that we're going to be looking at. Is we're looking at the context of where we're looking at leadership to give rise to its definition, because the context or the situation we find ourselves in changes the nature of the definitions that we're going to be utilizing. All right, so in order to help define this type of thing, the text referred to different types of metaphors that would utilize for defining leadership. So we have the competitive market metaphor. So when we talk about the competitive market metaphor, we're talking about firms that operate in a market. The leader in that emerges, and that would be the firm that is able to capture the largest share of the market, which is the most profitable, therefore would be the most profitable. That's that. The administrative metaphor would be the administrative type of circumstance where the administrator with the most amount of power or authority would be the one that would be the leader. Collective bargaining is usually associated with unions. So in a collective bargaining situation, leadership is defined in terms of those who are able to yield or wield the most amount of power in a collective bargaining circumstance. In democratic metaphor would speak to those people who can get the most amount of support. So we all work in a democratic environment, and if I ask for you to vote for something, the person who gets the leadership is the person who has the most amount of votes. Consensus, which is similar to democracy, is more along the lines, I don't agree with you, but I agree to support you kind of situation with that. Anarchy would be a different circumstance altogether, where in some level of anarchy, you have those people who are sort of mob rules approach to how leadership is defined. Independent judiciary, that has to do with judgment and law and those who are in authority. Plebiscitary, that's autocratic leadership. That would be what I say goes kind of things. Now, different metaphors, that's the idea, is to try and simplify the situation. The metaphor that I liked coming out of this thing was the metaphor of music, because I think we can all see this. And the metaphor that they're looking at here is the metaphor of an orchestra or symphony. So when we look at this, we can see the leader there. The leader is the conductor in front, and he's instructing all these people and pulling them all together to produce a sound that is pleasing for everybody. And the reason why he's there is because something has given him permission or authority to stand among all of these other musicians who are probably gifted musicians and he is allowed to be there because of some element of training that he has that gives him the potential to set everything moving forward. So let's think about it on a smaller scale. We move away from that large band situation to a smaller band. Are there any musicians among us here today who played in a band or have played in the band prior to today? No musicians? Or nobody willing to sell themselves out as a musician? Speaking of which, you also go ahead.
I'm not a musician, but I deal with musicians very often.
In what context do you deal with them?
I'm a singer, so I work with musicians
So well,
and working along with musicians.
Well, that means you're a singer. That means you're a musician. What do you mean?
Well, my voice is my instrument, yes.
Yes, that's what it is. Are you part of the music program in Costa?
No, I'm not.
Did you all see a message come to students today about the loss of one of our colleagues from the music department, Mr. Wayne Bruno? You all saw that in your emails today at all?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, we got that.
Yeah, he's a fantastic guitarist and band leader, and he was a great teacher. So big loss then. He's a young guy too, so I know he wasn't well, but at the same time, still difficult. And just recently lost another lecturer from another young lecturer as well, too, who's younger than me, from the communications and Ken Gordon School. Um, Somebody's here from graphics. Who's that again? Andrew. You know what I'm talking about? Mr. Nanton.
Actually, no.
Mr. Nanton was also beginning of the semester. He died as well. So it's really something else. Departments have been going through some significant changes. All right. So the reason I'm thinking about the music here is because you're in a smaller unit here in a jazz unit, right? And I like the way to discuss here. A leader, let's leave off the word jazz, and we say a band leader must choose the music, find the right musicians, and perform in public, more importantly. And the performance is dependent upon the environment, the volunteers, people, or the people playing in a band, the need for everybody to perform individually as well as collectively, the absolute dependence of the leader on the members of the band and the band on the leader, and the need for the leader for the followers to play well. Now, Dana, you're a singer, and if you are singing and the back and the people, so technically when you're singing in a band, you're taking the forefront because everybody has to take your lead to run with the music. That would you agree with that?
Agreed.
Right? So that if you are singing, then you are musically in charge of a number of things. For instance, the timing, the the expression that's going in, and therefore everybody's going to be performing off of you. Now, doesn't always work that way. It depends upon sometimes the strongest. I found when I've performed it with other musicians, it's dependent a lot upon who's the strongest ego in the room. Have you ever come across that situation?
Oh, all the time.
Right.
Mostly it's musicians.
Well,
Either the keyboardist or the drummer. I'm sorry, it is a fact.
keyboardist or the drummer. All right. So I've always come across the in my case a lot of times the problem child is the guitarist.
Okay, okay. I've
The-
never encountered that.
right. So the and this has to do with guitar soloists, right? Not necessarily the guitarist.
Correct.
Um, but those people who are in soloing positions or those who want to kind of bring everything together. So when sometimes you're in a situation and you're performing like that, you find that even though you are in charge, your keyboardist might tell you, hey, pull it back, that kind of stuff. So what we tend to defer to is the person with the greatest amount of experience. But regardless of how experienced that individual is, you'll only sound as good as the weakest member of the group, because collectively you're making music together. And if one person is not as good as everybody else, it keeps the whole band back, not so?
Yes, it does. It does.
Right.
There's a lag.
All right. So they either have to help support that person and bring him up to, or they try and say, you ain't good enough to be here, bust a kite, kind of things like that. Yeah,
Correct.
that's what happens. So when you see a lineup like this, who are you looking at there who might be in charge? And there, notice there are no keyboards there. The sax guy?
The trumpet.
Nope. The drummer.
Nope, not
The
trumpet.
drummer.
The
The
drummer.
drummer.
The
Slow
drummer is
motion
True,
controlling,
yes,
is
yes, yes.
drummer
Yeah,
is
the drummer
controlling
sets
the
the pace.
pace.
Yes.
So the drum and the bass, they set the foundation upon which those two other voices, the saxophone and the trumpet, can actually. So the trumpet is almost like the vocalist. They're like the lungs, and the that saxophone there looks like an alto sax. So, but it's going to play more of a rhythmic approach to things. But understand there are a lot of other ensembles that can be created when you're dealing with this metaphor. But the idea would be that we can only be a leader in the context of what everybody else is able to get out of it. So our performance is based upon everybody working together in a cooperative manner. That's the nature of leadership that the program that we're looking at is going to be looking to develop. That is the type of leadership that we're looking at. Because if you look at what the priest says here in this piece here, the jazz metaphor is powerful, illustrating inclusiveness, valuing everybody, the individuality, showing the importance of the public good. Because remember, we're performing, so we want it to sound good for everybody, you know? Empowering people to realize their personal gifts and talents. So it means rather than putting people down and saying, hey, you can't play crap, you know, your song is stupid, you know, you try, hey, try this instead and see if you can help deal with, okay, I'll slow down for us to kind of get that piece going well. That's the kind of showmanship you're talking about, the people working together to help to lift each other up so that the final show will be something that everybody's happy with. Right, and we don't go crying down each other, and that's something that a lot of musicians tend to miss out on. And that you get people who would be backbiting about this person and doing that and that person, whereas you know you could help somebody else to improve, unless of course they're not willing to listen. And that is speaks to now the whole issue of communicating and being in that open environment, open inclusive environment. We getting that? Dana, are you following that concept?
Yes, I am. I
Yeah.
am because I see it happening even with me and other people that I'm around. When you are more inclusive and you help the person as opposed to shutting them out, there is a greater sense of camaraderie, and the band is able to flow better with each other.
Right. So I
So
get good
it makes it
vibes.
much easier, yeah, for everybody.
Right. And the nice thing that you're bringing up here that ties into what's coming up next here, that the Ross uses the metaphor of leadership as an episodic affair. Now, it means therefore when you are in leadership positions, it doesn't mean that you're going to be engaging in leadership every second of every day. All right. It means that there are times when you're going to be engaged in leader specific activities, and there are times you're going to be in different activities. So if you're a manager, you're going to find yourselves engaged in management activities as opposed to leadership. So think about when you are in a situation like, so if we go back to Dana's example, when she's taking charge of a number in a performance where she's performing, she may be taking a more leadership role during that period. But if she's doing supporting vocals for another artist, then she has to take a backseat. She's no longer leader then. That makes sense?
Correct. Yes.
Right?
Yes, sir.
And even if you're stepping back even further, where you're not there to do any vocals, but just to add a look to the band while they're doing an instrumental piece. So it varies. The leadership shifts over from one person to the next. So it means that even though you are a leader, you're not leading at all times. And that's something important that leadership has to recognize. People who are in leadership positions aren't leaders all the time. They are different things during different activities. So for example, think about your manager at work. So when we go to work and you have your manager there, you're looking at them and say, well, okay, as the manager. But is it that they're doing leadership activity all the way through? Half the time they sit down in the office doing work on their own. That's not leadership. All right. They may not even be in the office for that matter. For some of you. So those are the kind of things I talk about. The episodic type of situation. We don't engage in leadership every second of every day. We engage with it at some periods during the day. And what we have to remember is that when we do engage in leadership activities, we need to be consistent with what we're doing across the board for that. Okay. Here we're going to look at the theories that developed over time in relation to this whole concept of leadership. Complex, elusive phenomenon, multidisciplinary approach to looking at it. These are the terms we're going to look at. We're going to be looking a lot of it from behavioral scientist approaches, because I think they have been able to contribute some of the most important developments to the study of leadership and the theories that have been developed over time. But let's start from well, as with anything, one of the problems that comes up with the leadership theories that have been developed is that they tended to be very simplistic in nature, and you're trying to use a very simple system to explain a very complex thing, and therefore there's going to be a gap between the theory that you've developed and the reality. So there's almost what we call a satirical approach to things, or you're going to get that ironic break between the two. Now, regardless of the fact, it does still mean that although we haven't been able to study this enough, it means that a lot of the theories have been able to make some concrete contribution to understanding the broader concepts of the theories. Now, the theories that we're going to be looking at here, and we may not be able to complete all of them, you all should be able to go on and look at most of them on your own, is the Greatman approach, the traits approach, behavioral approaches, contingency approaches, influence theories, reciprocal leadership approaches, and chaos theory, not necessarily in that order. The influence theories is probably going to be one of the last ones we look at. All right, so let's look at the Greatman approach. So basically, the Greatman approach is early on in life, as I said, 1300s, early on. Darwinistic thinking is really what was looking at the base of this particular concept. So here is where only great men, important, great men made good leaders or were leaders. All right. Now, if we think about Darwin's theory was, survival of the fittest, the theory of evolution and that type of stuff. And in the theory of evolution, only the fittest survived. And that means that only those characteristics of an individual that will lead them to surviving over others would allow that those traits to move forward, or those hereditary properties, as they talked about here, to help them to move forward. So the idea was that great men were a line of families who were leaders, and those leaders had some sort of power or influence that they developed, and that particular um, set of individuals would have to try to make sure that they were able to reproduce and therefore remain in that leadership role. That led to the development of the aristocracy and that type of stuff. So much so that it actually created some problems where you had a lot of intermarriage taking place, and that inbreeding tended to create problems. Now, of course, the great man theory had some very specific problems. One with the intermarriage element, that element that came up, and the fact that it focused on great men only and ignored great women. So, for example, the theory would not accept or recognize people like Joan of Arc or Catherine the Great because they simply didn't meet the theory, which is the law. The law was it had to be for you to be a good leader or to be a leader, you had to be a man, and you had to be a man that came from a great family. You had to have a great background that you came from. Now, that was like when we talk about that, here you're talking about the royals, all right, that kind of situation, the aristocratic people. So I mean, recently I had the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, and what happens next is that after she's finished, as she's gone, her son now replaces her on the throne, and her son was the product of herself and the father. Um, God, I can't remember his name, but it's another Philip guy. But if you go backwards, you'd realize that their history has always been one family, and then the son, and then the child from that, and so on. If you go backwards in their history, and that's where this great man theory, kind of comes from. So notice the use of the word folklore. I found that interesting when they were describing this theory. So we know that this theory also spoke to something that's a little more nefarious, which is only certain people can be leaders. And it was dependent upon your birthright and your genetics, which led to a whole set of other things that came up later on, which started to find itself in the second approach, even more, which referred to the traits approach, which basically in the 1900s here, the latter part of the 1900s, so they moved away from the great man theory and started to look and say, okay, we can't just keep it only in one family range, but we have to look for a particular set of traits that people showed, that men in particular showed, that would mark them as being leaders. And this emerged as a second generation theory from the great man theory. Now, what we have to think about now, in the previous approach, we were looking at Darwinism, and Darwinism led to the emergence of a particular science called eugenics. And the traits that they were talking about here were traits that they ascribed to particular types of society, or particular races in society that they believed was what was necessary in order to become leaders. So again, you had to be male. You also had to be white. You had to be um, a what's the word? Aryan, blue eyes, blonde hair. Had to have a symmetrical face, that kind of stuff. So there was a whole host of these traits that they had to do or had to have in order to meet it. And eugenics was one of those things that was utilized to try to prove this concept. Now, again, during that period, we had that belief structure facing us, and in that period, in the early 1900s, you went into World War One and then soon after into World War II. Those things actually kind of contributed to the thinking of the people generally at that point in time. So it assumed that leaders had particular traits such as intelligence, height, self-confidence that differentiated them from non-leaders and thus made them successful. Research failed, however, to produce a list of those traits that people had to have in order to be characterized as a leader. So of course, this theory, the traits approach, failed to hold water and therefore eventually fell away. So what came next was behavioral approaches. So in this one, they tried to use social sciences to approach the study of leadership by looking at managers. So now we're coming out of World War One, and we started to get into Industrial Revolution. So during the Industrial Revolution, you had a lot of industrialization taking place, a lot of factory development of factory activities taking place. So what they started to do was they started to approach the study of this thing by looking at the behaviors of successful people as opposed to the behaviors of not so successful people. And in particular, they will go into factories and observe what people were doing and what kind of outcomes they were ending up with. And they tried to categorize the information or the behaviors that they were seeing and started to try and make some sort of connection between what they were seeing and the nature of the impact it's likely to have. So we had a couple of theories that came up. So they were looking at both effective and ineffective leaders. So to try and work out what was going on across the board. And so psychology in particular kind of impacted upon this because again, you're looking at those behaviors. Started early, but it really found its heyday in the 50s after World War II. Okay. So you have these two studies here. You have the Ohio State and the Michigan's University of Michigan study, and they produced these two behaviors: consideration and initiating structure. So consideration is described as the behaviors that a leader acts as a friend towards the subordinate. All right, so you're looking out for their welfare and showing concern. And initiating structure is the degree to which the leader defines and structures his or her role of the subordinate towards the attainment of the group's formal goals. So technically what you're talking about is that initiating structure behaviors with those that were focused on achieving the goals of the organizations. So they were seen as two independent activities, and therefore they tried to list or observe all of the behaviors of managers and try to do a checklist of how many times they did something along each line. And they didn't say any one was better or worse or positive or negative. What they were just looking at was how many times they did what and try to make some sort of draw some conclusions from what they were able to observe. So Blake and Morton proposed a different approach, and they have the same thing: concern for people versus concern for production. And again, they use the same kind of observational model where they'll go in and look at all of the actions that took place with this manager that were deemed to be concerned for people as opposed to concerned for production. So at the end of the day, what they found, they had the Michigan study here now that came up with 3 types of behaviors: task-oriented behaviors, relationship-oriented behaviors, and participative leadership behaviors. So they started to make this observation utilizing the Michigan study. So again, in each case, what they tried to do is to go into factories and make these observations. So picture a guy observing other people in a factory with a with a what do you call it, a clipboard, and he has this um, a lab coat on, and he has this checklist. So everything he's taking kind of mad scientist approach to this thing. Again, during this period, they still have this whole concept of eugenics being at the part of it. And again, they're looking for behaviors because again, you're going into the two things that they have eugenics still holding some weight, but more importantly, you have industrialization that's sitting there, and therefore there's a particular type of behavior that they're looking for. They're looking for outcomes that are generated by efficiency and those that are doing well and so on. This is, you have to remember, this is the beginning of the production process where mass production is starting to become something important. And in mass production, you had specialization taking place and division of labor and all that type of stuff that was coming out. So these were the things that they were looking at. Managers who were running plants like that, what were they doing that they observed? So they sit down and were trying to observe these things or standing up there. Now the problem that happens for anybody who's studied psychology or sociology or tried to do any sort of observational experiments is that the minute you know you're being observed, you start to change your behavior. Isn't that true? Anybody here is doing some sort of social studies or social work program? But across the board, what we start to realize, if there's nobody who's doing those programs, one of the problems that comes up when you're conducting this type of research is that people will change their behavior once they know they're being observed, which is one of the reasons why they tend to try to do blind observations, where you're not aware of the fact that you're being observed. All right. Now, of course, the main criticism that they came up with this is that you're trying to break down a very complicated set of behaviors by utilizing very simplistic behavioral cues. And that was one thing. So obviously there was no very specific outcomes. The majority of the research on leadership behavior ignored situational variables in terms of the context in which we were doing. And of course, the results turned out to be inconclusive and not consistent between the various studies or the places that we were looking at, okay? So that was that set of theories. Then we have situational contingency theory. So here now they said, okay, in the past we said, all right, those behavioral theories didn't take into consideration situation. So now we're going to take a new approach to this thing and start to look at how the same behaviors going to be in various contexts or situations. So the situation determines who will emerge as leaders. So this is the theory that they're trying to say, that if the situation changes or you move from one situation to the next, that situation will determine the leader as well as their behavior. Now, contingency theory tried to incorporate situational moderators variables to explain leadership effectiveness. It emphasized that leadership behavior could not be explained in vacuums, and therefore the situation had to be inclusive. So now you're going from one extreme where you're just looking at behaviors, now you're looking at putting all this weight now on the situation that you find yourself. So of course, again, going from one extreme to the other, you're obviously going to have problems. So then they came up with these two things here. You have the least preference co-worker LPC model, developed in the mid-60s. So again, now the 60s is we're still within that period of post-World War II, and you're in high levels of industrialization. A lot of the production is taking place in the American system, so you have a different situation there that's taking place, and there's something else that's going to come up in a little bit. Now, so you have the least preferred worker, which describes the relationship of the relationship between leader traits and effectiveness. And the second is the path goal theory. So here this theory, now these things sound really good, huh? I can imagine the write-ups on these things. So 1957, they posit that in essence, what they're saying is that if you set up a pathway to achieve the goals of the organization that include the personal goals of your workers, then you're going to find that the workers are likely to work harder at achieving the goals of the organization because the personal goals of the individual is seen as being attainable only through doing those things. So the task of the leader, second paragraph here, is to increase the personal rewards to subordinates for performance in order to make the paths to their goals clearer and easier while achieving the goals of the organization. So this is the carrot and stick approach. So motivational theory goes a lot to this type of study that came up here. And here they're talking about what leaders can do in organizations to be able to make that part appear to be more favorable, and what they can do to encourage people to be able to achieve those things while achieving the goals of the organization. All right, so obviously, because of the hairy-fairy nature of this particular approach to studying leadership, there was a lack of research being conducted because it was difficult, or is difficult, to conduct that type of research. And of course, they weren't able to make very clear connections between the two things that they were talking about there. Again, the methodologies that was associated were not working for the level of research they're looking at here. So influence theory. So first, they started to use this in terms of charisma. So in terms of charisma, Weber, or Max Weber, or Weber, depending upon how you pronounce it, started off in 1924 and then 1947. And contextually, what we need to think about coming out of 47 in particular is that was after the end of World War II, and you had a lot of research going on in terms of charisma, because they were trying to understand, how a country could allow somebody like Adolf Hitler to lead a country into that level of activity and that type of activity, primarily because he was seen as being very charismatic in terms of his approach to things. So Weber and others were studying this concept of charisma and looking at it to be one of the methods that leaders can utilize to try and instill upon people the kind of trying to look and see whether or not these influence theories could explain why some leaders work better than others. And they were trying to say, okay, well, charisma has something to do with it. But the problem with this was that, again, charisma was something that influenced or affected people so personally that it was very difficult for them to measure what the effect would likely to be, because charisma is something that is a personal experience of an individual that is harder. There's no external exhibiting factors that you can measure them. Let's put it that way. Yes, you can see people responding to individuals, but why they're responding is something on a personal level. Okay, so what they started to look at it here was, well, in 1977 here, you had this Robert House theory of charismatic leadership. One of the things that they started to notice here is that charismatic leaders tended to be associated, or the strength of charismatic leadership tended to be associated with times of significant change. So charisma is attributed to leaders by their followers. So I can't say I'm charismatic. Who has to tell me that? Would be people who I have interacted with, and they would need to indicate whether or not I am charismatic or not, because it's not something that there's a measure of, kind of thing like that. So charisma, again, is a subjective quality that is a response that you get from somebody else. So again, measuring that was going to be problematic. And another issue that came up with it was that most times people who were good at charismatic, or seen as very good charismatic leaders, tended to occur in periods when there was social change that was challenging the status quo, and that there was some sort of impetus to be able to do that. So think about Martin Luther King. Here we're talking about the civil rights movement, and you had a whole set of leaders who emerged during that period. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Edgar Mevers, what's his name again? Edgar, I can't remember, but there's a university named after him. So you had a number of these gentlemen who came up as different forms of charismatic leaders that arrived there. You even have to think about John F. Kennedy. All during this period of time, you were dealing with people who were charismatic, and what they were doing was that they were suggesting changes that challenged the status quo of the organizations or of the world in which they existed around the world. So the problem, of course, came up with this theory was that, and I want you to look at this, too much deference to individual leaders by followers can create a dangerous scenario where leaders misuse power or deliver a vision with an empty dream. And this is the problem that we talk about. People who know themselves to be charismatic. And here you have to start to think about some of the worst people who were charismatic. If we think about Marilyn Manson, for example, not Marilyn Manson, but the Manson family. You had Charlie Manson, actually. You had this guy, the Dr. Reverend Jones. You had the Moonies, David Koresh from the Texas, Waco, Texas situation. You have a whole set of these very negative, well, of course, Hitler and Stalin and Mao and the others that we talked about before. Yes, somebody wanted to say something?
When you were calling out the murders, I think there was this, I saw the documentary on Ted Bundy, and they said he was such a charismatic person, and that's why the numbers are so high, because women would just, they don't, whatever he said, they just go ahead with it and stuff.
Right, but he wasn't so much characteristic as narcissistic. All right, in terms of the way, but yes, he would have used that charismatic approach to get things done according to what he wanted. Yes, but he was very narcissistic. But again, when you think about it from the way we look at it is from the point of view that you're talking about them leading other people to do things on their behalf, as opposed to like a serial killer. But so you had these people who were able to lead other people into making serious decisions about their lives and the lives of their children and so on, and giving up on it to deliver a vision with an empty dream. So this is why you have these sort of cult development that takes place that you have to look at in terms of how that emerges over time. So the situation that you have to pay attention to here, basically, when you're dealing with charismatic theories, is that you have to be very careful with it, which is one of the reasons why charismatic theories tend to be, kind of at arm's length, because again, charisma is not something that's easily measurable, and far too often it's been used for very negative things. There have, of course, been positive people who have had charismatic approaches, but at the end of the day, a lot of them have not really survived the entire period for that, because a lot of people they looked upon and said, okay, like Obama was charismatic, but somebody might also say Trump is charismatic. I mean, again, charisma is something of sort of a what's the word I want to use? A very subjective type of response that you can have. All right. Okay. So next are the theories, 1970s, reciprocal leadership theories. So these theories emerged during a period of great change in society. So we're coming out of the late 60s into the 70s. What was going on in the world then? right. So we had flower power. We had a lot of free love thinking and a lot of taking
Revolution.
drinks. Right. That sort of social revolution. You also had the revolution against war and Vietnam and that type of stuff. So you had that type of discourse taking place in society. And that led to the development of in that context, reciprocal leadership theory started to emerge. So, so if we think about the context there, so now you have types of theories that emphasize mutuality, motivation, and the acceptance of leaders and followers working together to achieve some sort of better goal, something better for everybody else. So it's not about very personal goals or subjective profitability, but about goals of elevated importance. Right? So this is where we start to bring ethics into the behavior patterns. So leadership is not something about leaders does to followers, but rather leadership is a process that is meaningfully engaging leaders and participants, values contributions of participants, shares power and authority between leaders and participants, and establishes leadership as an inclusive activity among interdependent people. So that speaks to that kind of one love. We're all one people, and we have to look after the whole world around us, and that kind of we are the world kind of look that was going on back then. So it means that all of these theories that emerged during this period of time had this sort of transcendental type of approach to things. You have to also think about at this point in time, a lot of key musicians and cultural icons in society were also experimenting with Eastern culture. They were going across to India and China and all these places and Japan and getting themselves immersed into the cultures of those particular types of religions and belief structures, and they were bringing that back to Western society, and its influence is starting to show itself. So, of course, um, academics is not alone. It's not immune to the influence of these things. So, it started to absorb some of this thinking. So, some of the theories that emerged in out of these reciprocal type theories was the transformational leadership theory, the servant leadership theory, and the followership theory. Now, all of these start to look very familiar when we start to look at the relational leadership theory that we're going to look at. You start to see how these have actually started to influence them. So there's a whole set of the theories. So the transformational leadership theory. This is Burns in 78. So again, you see that period of influence. Transformational leadership period is a process where leaders and followers raise one another to higher levels of morality and motivation. So of course, here now you had during the 70s as well, you had this whole issue of distrust of leaders in the traditional sense. So here you wanted to develop leaders who had better morals and ethics. So that's the kind of focus that was going on. So those are the kind of things that they were looking at doing with each other. So again, it wasn't focused only on the leader, but it was focused on both the leader and the followers and how they were able to interact with each other to be able to get the best out of life. So you see things about higher ideals, moral values such as liberty, justice, equality, peace, and humanitarianism. As opposed to those lesser things such as fear, greed, jealousy, and hate. Now, in the last set of elections that took place in the United States, one of the things I noticed was that the parties that took part in anything all utilize fear, greed, jealousy, and hatred as values that they were kind of basically, if you don't vote for me, this will happen, and these people, and it was all this programmed fear that was going on, and we can't trust these people, and they hate these people, and I was telling myself, I said, well, where did the love bit go from? Where did the equality, the peace, and that kind of stuff? We even hear that in our own local elections, where the focal point of the politicians is about all the negative things that the other party has done, and we will not do that. We promise to be better, and then you get into power and you do the same damn stripping us. Just my point. And there's no appealing to people about higher ideas and purpose. So we wait for after the elections, and then we start to talk about healing has to start. And yeah, maybe we need to do that, but maybe you could stay away from the whole point of view of trying to utilize these lesser values and emotions to drive things. But again, who am I? Maybe some sort of hairy fairy hopeful. All right, so that's the transformational thing. So we understand the context of what was going on with that. Now, so the main thing about this whole theory is that basically it was not about the basic things that we saw before. It's about us working together to achieve good common goals that was good for everybody, and that therefore was transformational in nature. That if I'm the leader, my job is to make you leaders as well and empower you all to become different, and we hold ourselves to higher levels of activities or higher ideals, ethical ideals, and we have high levels of things. So these are some transformational leaders in the past. So we have JFK, we have Mahatma Gandhi, we have Abraham Lincoln, we have JFK, Mother Teresa, and Martin Luther King. And last night I was looking over this with another class, and I noticed, interestingly enough, of these 6 people, 4 of them were assassinated because of the transformational leadership potential that they had. That's interesting, isn't it? The 2 others, because maybe they weren't JFK, not JFK, FDR here, he probably wasn't because he was during the period of the war. So people kind of looked upon him as, leading them out of the war. So it was like a war hero. And Mother Teresa is about poverty and children in particular, and those people who are vulnerable. So it was in the areas of transformation that was threatening any sort of status quo. But these gentlemen here all challenged status quos in societies that they were working in. He started off with challenging the slavery days or the slavery institution. Then we had JFK. He was challenging the status quo of, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for the country, that type of situation. He was also threatening some of the status quo in the society around us. Martin Luther King was obviously seeking transformation of the civil environment that we were living, so the civil rights movements that was taking place, and of course, the Mahatma Gandhi, he was looking at the independence of India, and unfortunately, that also had an impact upon the Muslim nation as well, and that's where things started to become, again, changing the life of people and transformation, and they paid ultimate prices for it. I thought that was interesting when I looked at the choices I made in terms of leadership for these guys. All right, so moving forward, we have the transformational leadership, and transformational leadership was often or is oftentimes compared to transactional leadership. And transactional leadership is one where basically you do something and you get something in return for it. So it's a transaction. If you do X, then you get Y, kind of situation like that. So exchange of value for both individuals. So most people view transactional leadership as a lesser form of leadership than transformational. But as we will start to see, all forms of leadership has a role in the overall purpose of getting things done. So something that you'll be looking at in more details possibly later on. All right. Leaders can engage in both transformational and transactional to get the goals that they're dealing with, as long as you are holding on to those higher ideals and moral values between the leaders and followers. Of course, critics of the theory speak about a lack of clarity and specificity that creates problems. Again, because of the hairy-fairy nature of it. So the servant leader theory is similar to that. This is where the whole concept of the leader is a servant to the followers. And the purpose of the servant leader is to help prepare the transformation of followers into leaders. Make sense? Um, so the concept here now is that anybody who wants to be a leader has to see themselves as a servant of the people to whom you're going to be working for. Now, um, that is something that you're going to deal with, well, one of the groups is going to deal with in a lot more detail um, than I can do here when you're dealing with, I think, power and influence. I think that comes up with that area, servant leadership. So you'll be dealing with that in some more detail there. So again, in this situation, there is a reciprocal nature between the leadership and the people that you're serving. So it means that you are in a situation where you are looking at, as I said here, you're holding the institution in trust for the greater good of society. So you are facilitating the movement of your organization to move into a role where it's going to be more beneficial for the the society that you're working in or that you're operating in. Again, this is all about, again, that whole transformational approach, again, to look at making sure that what you're doing is having a positive impact on society and on people, and that you are trying to be better off or to leave the world a better place than you met it. Again, this is synonymous with Eastern culture and Eastern thinking that what we do ought to move us forward rather than move us backwards. So that whole servant leadership process that we're talking about here was again about a process of being able to make others join your organization. Another version to this is the steward model or the stewardship model, all right, which is Peter Block's model that we talked about here. So you're the steward of the organization that you're basically going to be looking after the place until the next person comes in. So we are leaving things in readiness for the next generation to come forward. So again, it's all about continuity and making sure that we leave things better for those who come behind us. All right. And basically all of them are all speaking to the whole concept of interdependence, and those people who are coming behind us, we have to prepare the way for them. So it's all really nice thinking theories. So the same, when we get to the last one here, the followership theory, this is the same thing. Here now you're focusing on the leader is preparing followers to take the place. So therefore, the followers are more important, or if not as important, as the leader themselves. And we sort of met this before when we looked at the Kelly model of alienated followers, sheep, yes, people. What you're looking for is developing effective followers, those who are willing to walk the road with you in terms of getting to moving into those positions of authority and taking over the leadership of an organization in a more productive manner than possibly what you're doing. So here to talk about the qualities of these followers. They manage themselves well, they commit to the organization, purpose, principles, and persons outside themselves. They build their competencies and focus on efforts for maximum impact. They're courageous, honest, and credible. Those are the kind of things that those types of followers need to do. Leaders and followers look at themselves as co-adventurers. That's important. Co-adventurers is a nice phrase to take it. I talked about using the phrase of associates in accomplishing these goals. So again, it's about, the theory is trying to look at, us working together as one, If I'm the leader, I'm going to prepare things for you guys to take over and move from that point. The reciprocal, the relational leadership model is going to look at this again. All right, so Ross describes the leadership theories in the 20th century using the industrial paradigm model. So this is another, these are more emerging models that are coming up now. So the industrial, the problem with the current situation that we face here, we're dealing in an industrial era with massive and fast changes. It is the theories that were developed coming out of that industrial era were structurally functionalist, meaning that they had to fit the structure of the industry. They were management oriented. They were focused only on the leader. So these are the things like the behavioral approaches and stuff that I was talking about. They were male oriented. They were individualistic in outlook, utilitarian and materialistic in ethical perspectives, rational, technocratic, linear, quantitative, language, and methodology. So all those older theories, the contingency, the behavioral approaches, all of them tended to be this more industrial approach. So you'd see our education system actually follows the same kind of thing, which is why when we sit in a class, if you look at the way a class is set up in rows and that kind of stuff, that's set up like, you go to work. So when you go into offices, you see people sitting in cubicles in rows, and in fact, it gets so bad now, they put you in cubicles to lock you away from each other, because if you all see each other, you all talk too much, you interact too much, and you get distracted from doing the work that you need to do. How many of you are working in environments like that, either open floor or cubicled? Any of you are working in a cubicled environment? No?
No, sir. No.
What are you working, open floor?
Yeah, to me, I guess it would bring about, I prefer that than a cubicle.
Right,
Because
but
in a cubicle,
how
it'd
would,
be more.
let me ask you a question. How are the desks arranged?
I guess if you have a Rubik's Cube in front of you, everyone is next to each other.
In a row?
Um,
Rows and columns?
I guess you could say, but definitely it'd have a good bit of space between us.
Right, but there's rows and columns, right?
Yeah, because you have a good bit of other desks as well, because you have real files.
Right, yeah, that's your work stuff, but I'm talking about where you all sit. Rows and columns, right? Well, you're still using what we call industrial era office setups. So you're stuck here in this particular model. Do you mind telling me where you work or what industry you work in?
In the private sector, sir, I would leave it at that.
All right, and that's because generally what happens in a situation like that is that some manager or leader in your organization wants to pay a lot of attention to what's happening on the floor so that they can manage what's taking place there. All right, okay, so if we're to move away from those paradigms, we have to remember what paradigm we live in now. And that paradigm, even as identified in this text, has changed since then. So the paradigm that they're talking about here has to talk about reciprocal leadership theories, allowed us to experience a paradigm shift from the industrial paradigm to the post-industrial paradigm of leadership. So now we're talking about after that whole industrialization period. More integrated understanding of contemporary leadership theory is necessary, one that relies on the new ways of thinking about leadership. So what we need is more flexible leadership models that can deal with the current circumstances we find ourselves working in. One that is working with, the level of connectivity that we're dealing with, the amount of ICT that generates us, the immersiveness of that ITC that we're working in, and the possibility that it could become even more immersive as we move further in time, or as time progresses. Um, Faced with an unprecedented economic, technological, socio-political, and moral ethical changes or sea of change, there is a need for new theories and new applications and just plain new way of thinking about it. So let's look at what they've come up with in terms of the theories. The first concept or the first idea we have to deal with is that most of what we've been taught in school in the past is no longer relevant. And primarily, most of this has to do with the fact that the assumption was that the world will be a nice, orderly place, and that is not true. The world is a messy place, and unfortunately, a lot of us have problems operating where there is no order, at least no order that we can see. And we have to have theories capable of dealing um, with environments that are not orderly, that are not going to follow those rules that we like. So anybody who has OCD, for example, will have problems operating in worlds like this, which is one of the reasons why a lot of modern people or people today suffer from anxiety issues, because trying to deal with all of that stuff is problematic across the board. All right. So what are the theories that have been developed for that? Let me take you to that so that we can look at it one time. So the first theory that was discussed was the chaos theory, and chaos theory is looked at as a theory that can deal with order without predictability. So that although there is chaos surrounding us, it's important that inside that chaos there exists a pattern that we cannot see. Now, for those of you who may be familiar with chaos theory, this comes from that thinking. Now, again, chaos theory comes from this chaos system comes from that chaos thinking, that chaos theory that they developed. Notice the time frame, the 90s. Okay, so it views the world as a unstable environment, but inside that unstable environment, there exist patterns that are not normally easy to see, and we have to learn to work in that environment. So that as a leader, you're going to have to be looking at changing some of the behaviors that you've been talking about, um, that will enable you all to operate in that world. So that the idea is that if we cannot input into that situation order, we can't force order into that world, but we have to seek connectivity in the relationships between them. So that this theory of chaos and systems is to find systemic methods inside the theories to be able to work things through. Okay, it's a world filled with strange attractors and force fields that help shape the behavior of individuals and organizations. So what we're talking about, it's a world, we have to accept that the world that exists today can't be controlled. So what are we going to be able to do? First off, we have to be sensitive to the initial change. That is, we need to know and understand as much as we can about what caused the initial conditions that existed. And because it's important for us to know what happened at the beginning. And then what we need to be looking for is we have to realize that we are going to rely on the connections we make with the other people around us, which means we need to be aware of the andness of things and the anding of things. So there are two terms there that you have to be aware of. In a world where there is no systemic way to look at it, there's just, you're surrounded by chaos. What you have to look at is what connectivity you've been able to develop. So that you're going to be connecting things together and connecting people together with yourself. And you're also going to be looking at how you can develop responses that are not singularly correct, but partially correct. So that's another element that you're talking about. Some things might not be right or wrong, but it might be right and wrong. So we have to stop thinking in ones and zeros. We have to start thinking in one or zero, one and zero. So we have to start thinking in things in a broader continuum. You can have both and not either or. So that's a difficult thing for people who have problems with living in a world of gray and everything is black and white. So again, this is one of the reasons why a lot of people have anxiety issues in the world around us, because one, we like to be self-reliant, and we say we don't need other people for us. This theory is telling you no, we are dependent on other people to get through this life. Two, no one approach to something is going to be perfectly correct. In fact, it might take more than one incorrect approach to finally arrive at a correct approach that in itself is full of faults. So that's the whole situation that you're talking about there. And even if you find a solution, it is not going to be the solution that you really wanted. All right. And this world of chaos that they speak about is one that you have to get used to working in. And for somebody who has OCD, it can create some serious issues. All right. I mean, if you think about the world of our world now, not even post-pandemic, we're still in the midst of all that nonsense. And is anything right or wrong, basically? It's sort of like when I was designing these classes, I'm borrowing things from everybody and all, and nothing is really the right way, but it's some right, some wrong, some correct. It's all big borrowed and try to get things moving and trying to find the best thing to move forward. So in the past, where you're looking for the perfect setup, that perfect setup no longer exists. You have to work within the issues and the problems that you have facing you, or else you're going to get stuck and do nothing. And that's something that a lot of people have problems with. I don't know if any of you all have issues like that. That you love to do things and you prefer to do things where everything's nice and set up and in a nice organized environment, but have problems operating outside of that context. Anybody? You know, you're supposed to be contributing. And just say it, huh? Wish I was given marks. Go on, Dana.
I can't. I just can't operate in chaos.
Ready?
Well, so I haven't, let me say this, I haven't learned to operate in chaos where there's chaos. Stuff must be organized. It must have some type of system, some type of procedure in order to function in an environment.
But what will happen if you come across a circumstance where there is no time to create order in your?
Is there really no time to create order, even ad hoc or at the point in time there may be something that you can do to make something go in a particular order?
All right. So one of the things I can advise you is, you see the little space around you. If you have issues with working in circumstances or situations where you must have order, organize the space around you, but you have no control over the space beyond you. Understand that. but you have to be willing somebody to come into your space and make a mess. Because remember, you have to end with that person to find a solution. So somebody's mess has to interfere with yours. Yes, woo, hands are up. Shakid and Sean. Let's deal with Shakid first.
Yes, sir. So, I actually at times kind of prefer to work in a more chaotic environment because I believe it prepares you to deal with a bunch of situations not always related to work.
Correct,
It
yes.
prepares you to be, you know,
To deal
more
with
readily.
to deal with
Huh?
life. To deal with
Yeah,
life.
basically.
Right. That makes so much sense. That's quite true. All right. Perfect. Perfect. Sean, you wanted to make a contribution as well?
Yes, I totally agree to what you just said.
Uh-huh.
Within a chaotic in a chaotic environment actually teaches you and actually develop your actually well to
Develop
develop your skill set,
skills.
different
Yes.
different sectors, decision skills, all different kind of interception skills that you could basically evolve.
Yeah.
It's true in chaotic environment opposed to a calm environment.
Yes. And that
Yeah,
is something that we all have to learn. We have to learn that concept of being able to operate in circumstances and situations that is not our best environment, because you can't expect that you will be able to find or create that environment at all times. Okay, and that is problems, situations you're going to find yourself in. It happens more than you know, that you're going to end up in a situation where you're going to be dealing with problems that you have no way to find a solution. So like this quotation here, many problems facing communities, groups, and organizations are difficult and have no simple answers. There is, if there's an answer that seems obvious, it will have been tried sometime in the past and may or may not have worked or succeeded. The problem is the complex situations that we're going to face coming in your life means that you have to be able to, as Sean said, start to develop the skill sets to treat with it. Because if you don't, you're going to get left on the wayside, because they're not going to wait for you to develop the skills. You have to develop it real time. As it starts to go wrong, you have to rise to the occasion and meet the challenge, which is one of the things I could say procrastinators tend to fall into this category of chaos because we've simply just left everything to the last minute, and that chaos is kind of like training a training ground for not that I would tell you go procrastinator, but I'm just saying that procrastination is one of those things that kind of helps you prepare for chaotic periods. But of course, there are much better skills you can develop with that. All right, so let me leave the chaos system and take us to the authentic leadership, which is the last one. So one of the latter pieces of development that took place is about authentic leadership. And basically what this theory is trying to say to us is that leadership requires that people are authentic, that they are authentic humans, that we are not trying to put out an image of ourselves that is not true. Because at the end of the day, if you try to lie, it will eventually come out. And it's again, it's a reciprocal thing, because if you are going to be your authentic self, the expectation is that the people you're dealing with are also going to be authentic as well. Now that means we have to trust each other. Now that is difficult because a lot of people who are open and trustworthy are oftentimes hurt by people around them and taken advantage of, and that is problematic, because it tends to negatively impact upon this particular model that they're talking about here. So look at this description here of an authentic leader. It's as the confluence of positive psychology, transformational leadership, and moral ethical leadership. and the authentic leader as someone who is confident, hopeful, optimistic, resilient, transparent, moral or ethical, future oriented, and gives priority to development associates to be leaders. So this is who the authentic leader is. Problem with this is that it's a two-way street. Both leaders and followers, or the people who are working in this organization, have to be honest with each other. Problem with this theory. What do you all see the problem with that theory? If we understand that, yes, Shakib.
I think a big issue here is that it's heavily reliant on expectations on both ends of the parties, and those expectations a lot of times just don't line up.
Correct. Because the problems with it is that we expect that everybody's going to play a level, be level.
Yeah,
And that is not true. You're quite right. Oftentimes people are going to take advantage of other people because that's what they were brought up. That was why they behave the way they do. So authentic leadership is an ideology an ideal really, almost like a theoretical model that we can aim towards. But until we get that, I don't know what we'd have to get. A chip installed that prevents lying or something along those lines, um, then we'd have to deal with, trying to be as authentic as we can within the realm of protecting ourselves. But the model actually speaks to, having no guards up and that kind of stuff. So all those are lovely model, and it's one of the more modern models that we're looking at. Is from 2005, it's like 15 years ago, 15 to 10 years ago actually. That transparency, opening, and see all these things there: transparency, openness, trust, guidance towards worthy objectives, and emphasis on follower development. Those are the characteristics of the model that they're talking about. This is all about the other is more important. Now, at the end of the day, somebody who comes into a situation where they meet somebody like this, they can be inspired to follow this particular thing. But because we are so jaded by what we've experienced as leadership around us, meeting somebody like this is almost like too good to be true, and therefore what I can't see it, I can't believe it. Yes, Shakib, Miles.
hi sir. Um, I think a big part of it is that that whole reliance on expectations that we have in our head. I think what we fail to do is expect others to be themselves, to act as themselves.
Correct. Yeah, that's quite correct. But and it has to do with the fact that in a lot of instances we are dealing with people who put up airs, and we have great difficulty trusting because we've been hurt in the past. And this is a big ask. This authentic leadership model is a huge ask. I mean, I could see the guidance towards worthy objectives and emphasis, but that absolute openness and transparency, that's a difficult ask for people in environments that are surrounded with deceit and distrust. Um, so again, I think one of the things that they talk about with this model is that it's some of its expectations, a little, what's the word I want to use, beyond um, beyond realistic expectations. So I think there's a criticism of it somewhere here. Um, it's basically the same thing over and over again. Um, right, leadership studies, scientific discipline. All right, so again, it's all right. So here, okay, so again, that's the main. For me, that's the main problem, I think, with the model. It's not necessarily very realistic in its application. It would be lovely if we can, but it's not necessarily realistic across the board. All right, any questions? This is just a summary here. You guys can go through this slower if you want. It's available on the e-classroom. All right, so you don't have to memorize any of this stuff. Just get to know it and understand it and exist at it. It's outside there. Any questions, guys, that you want to ask? Anything you want clarification about? All right. Okay, so if that's the case, then I'd like to bid you good night, but I would like to speak to Daryl and who are the people here by yourself? Daryl, Tyrell, and Vikash, if it's possible.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I'd like to speak to those three. Good night, guys. Thanks for being here.
Good night,
Questions.
everybody.
Good night,
Thanks,
everyone.
Thanks.
Good night. Good night.
I need to stop the recording.